way, it's sort of what you were saying is sort of what the Crown is always trying to do, right? It's always, which has been a really interesting conversation in the UK recently about fact, fiction, reality, whatever. And so it's sort of what we've been saying now for a few weeks. What we're trying to do always is sort of really get into that crevice, that really sort of private, intimate place. And I think that's what Peter does so beautifully, and that's always what he's writing for us to do. So it was a really interesting process getting into that. I was doing press only recently for this here, and I found myself realizing that I had a lot of time because it was the pandemic, so I could sort of absorb and almost sort of by osmosis just spend a lot of time with her and try and understand what she was going through, and versus obviously the sort of public-facing mask that we all know. So who you are at your core and find that authentically whilst being watched by the world, it's an exceptionally difficult thing to do. And so I feel like that's sort of what the journey is in this season of somebody who's incredibly raw, really, at the beginning, and then learns how to, or at least we watch her try to sort of grab a hold of the reins of the narrative of who she is. And there's always a duality, isn't there? There's sort of what she wants the world to know and believe about her, is just sort of have them on side, and then there's also the truth of who she is really at her core. And I think the thing with Diana is they often are the same thing, because what she is incredibly honest about herself. She always was so honest, you know, which takes an incredible amount of courage to be vulnerable and be honest and let people into that. So.
Absolutely, and obviously in working on a show like The Crown, there's an incredible amount of research that goes into it with Peter Morgan and his entire team. And I've heard that when they were asking about what research you wanted, your answer was everything. And given how much there is because of the time period in terms of video footage and photographs and interviews that you could look at for reference, how did you then take the research that they had accumulated and distill down what are the pieces that are going to be really useful to me in finding both who she is as a character emotionally, and then even just the physicality of that as well?
The lady who runs it, her name's Annie, and I had a Zoom with Annie. I was in Australia, and Annie said, "What do you want?" And I said, "Give me everything." Which I immediately regretted, because I'm someone who loves to do my homework. And then I opened up this little archive and I was like, holy cow, Jesus Christ. But I had this time because it was the pandemic. And so that was a really interesting process, because I think driven by fear, by this sort of great, juicy fear that definitely ebbed me along in the beginning of the process. I thought, well, I'm just going to jump in as deep as I can. But of course, then that sort of was incredibly overwhelming, because you think, how can you know a life? How do I get as close to the truth of things as possible? And I found myself watching a lot. I read a lot, but that was really interesting too, because I would get, I kind of knew I was starting to get close to something, because I'd get a quarter of the way through the book, and then I find myself sitting on the couch and thinking, how dare you? I mean, that's not true. It's so defensive. And then I think, who wrote this? So then I throw that book away. I became like absolutely livid. I think, well, how do you know that's what she was thinking? And so I read and I watched, but the things that I started to love were that, I realized I was sort of hunting for footage and things written that somehow didn't have an agenda. I wanted the rawest things. And I also wanted to try, because it's interesting with these characters, because they are so public facing, they understand how to manipulate. So you're kind of always looking and you're hunting for the things that, it's almost like where they're not aware, that split second, or where something surprising might happen and the mask drops. And so I was hunting around for a lot of sort of unedited sort of newsreel footage, that the BBC had of them getting out of a car when they went to Korea, and it was some terribly distressing, sad trip, and you see them just sort of sitting in the car before they know that someone's photographing them, and you look at their body language and you think, oh, that's interesting, and that's something I can hook into. But I had to spend enough time with it that it soaked in somehow, that I wasn't thinking when it came time to do it, and I think the same thing with the dialect, which I spent a lot of time doing. And you know, and it's so funny. I was in Australia. I was doing these Zoom calls with my dialect coach. He's a genius, and he has done all of these voices and created, you know, and we have these ridiculous practice sentences that we walk around saying things about Fuzzy Wuzzy was a bear. It's just how where did it come from? And you walk out. It's so, you know, and then everyone in your family's washing the dishes going, Fuzzy Wuzzy was a bear. And it's mad, and you sort of just become completely obsessed with everything. But my poor sister, she'd be in the shower and she'd be doing these terrible, you know, she'd go, God damn it, Elizabeth, I'm doing Diana's voice all the time. But I sort of knew that there was this huge surplus that was available, and so I had to let the things that were going to stick, I just had to let them stick, and then the other stuff was always going to fall away, you know. But you're not in control of that, so yeah.
I also wanted to ask about working with Polly Bennett, who's a movement coach on the show as well, and refinding her voice in new ways. And did you have an idea of what the end goal was, of this is where I want her to get to as a person? Or was it, as you went scene by scene, you started to kind of almost discover where you felt her center was going to land?
Probably a little bit of both, but I think it's really fascinating doing a TV show like this, because I've not really done anything like this before, where I really got given this incredible part, and kind of the joy of doing TV is that you have so much time inside these people, but it also is this experience of you just sort of, someone sort of lets you out of the gate, and then you're just going, and you're going, and you're going, and you're going, and there's a lot that becomes quite unconscious, and you just come to work each day, and this person sort of keeps coming out of you. And I think it was probably more something I understood in retrospect, but it's very clear to me now that I was constructing it. It's also to do with what Peter was writing for her, but I had someone say to me, what do you think? What do you think, if you had to sort of sum it up, this is about this story of her? And I sort of found myself thinking, well, I think it's about somebody knowing that there is something inside them that nobody could touch, and getting back into contact with that thing, you know, and that is that source of strength, and it's sort of the most precious thing we have, but we can lose touch with that. And I think that what happens to this person, and we see it with how Emma played her, and it sort of gets ripped out of her hands so early in her life, when it's so incredibly young. Like, how can you even know it's there, you know? But through the course of this, I think that's what I was finding while I was playing her.
And there's insecurities that come to the surface from moments where she's in the car and then her brakes aren't working, and who could have possibly done this, being very aware of, I think people are listening on the phone, hearing clicks, and you know, I almost don't even want to call it paranoia, because it was warranted on her part. And so what did that open up in her emotional landscape for you, in knowing that if that's her day-to-day, every time she picks up the phone to call her son, someone could be listening, this could be a story in the papers tomorrow?
I mean, it's a devastating kind of part of her, because she was right, and we know, history tells us that she was right about it. And I think this happens to people in these positions where they're not believed, and in fact their instincts are completely accurate. I think what it does is that she's already in an extremely vulnerable place, and it just completely destabilizes her. If you don't feel like your most intimate space is safe, then it really sort of starts to dismantle your capacity to grasp reality, but also, I think, your capacity to understand who you can trust. And so much of this story for her in season 5 is a story of watching her sort of lose a grip on something, because she doesn't know who she can trust. And I think that if you're in a position where you're so watched, you need allies, you know, and she didn't have them, and I think that's what's so tragic.
And I mean, on the other side of her as a character, I love that we get such an exploration of her sense of humor and the lightness that exists. You know, I love the scene where she first shows up and is sitting with Muhammad Al-Fayed, and they just have 5 in-jokes with one another within about 2 minutes. And what did that open up in the way that you viewed her and the way that you were able to play her, and always being able to go to that side as well?
Well, for me, it was a joy. I used to joke all the time after doing some terribly sad crying scene. I'd say, God, I was trying to turn The Crown into a comedy one scene at a time. And I'd say to my daughter, can't you have the hiccups in this scene or just anything? No, you know. And so I was always looking for these moments, right? Because when I started to do that research, and I also spoke to quite a lot of people, strangely, I realized I knew quite a lot of people who had been very close to her. And the thing that I always heard people say, and I almost felt like it was vital to the people who knew her to get across this, that she had an incredibly tragic life in so many ways, but her vitality and her humor and her joy was so vivid. And you know, you just, as soon as people start talking about you hear like, well, I was doing this speech and I got up and she was sitting next to me, and the entire time she was pinching my bum and she just thought that was glorious, you know. And you think, I love that person, I just love that person. And it was really important to me, as much as I could, to thread that through, whether it's with the boys or, because I think there's something so childlike in the best way, you know, that she still had that sense of play, which is remarkable considering how difficult everything was. So.
Absolutely. Well, we have a couple of questions again that were submitted to us beforehand, and then if we have time, we'll you talk about what went into shooting that scene.
Well, it's an amazing scene. It's a really long scene, and Dom and I started calling it our one-act play. We didn't see each other very much on set because the stories they don't intertwine really until that point in the season. And every time I'd see him in the trailer, the sad car park rail trailers, where I'd say, when are we doing that play? I don't know, December. You know, so it was like this thing on the horizon all the time. And then we had this beautiful luxury of rehearsing it. And then we had 3 days to shoot it, which is also really unusual. And we moved through different sets to get these little moments in. It was also an entire day spent making an omelette. I'm not exaggerating. An entire day spent making an omelette. I think there's 40 seconds of it in the scene. And it was, this is a true story, it was the day that Peter came to set. And he got so grumpy, he said, "Are you going to make that omelette all day?" And we're like, "Yes." And then he said, I don't know, it was just the scheduling. But I think I made 42 omelettes or something. And I don't know, I wonder if that was almost a kind of, we were so relaxed after making the omelette 40 times that when we sat down at the kitchen table, there was always, I also loved that when we entered into this scene that we knew inevitably was going to descend into this really painful place, we were always laughing still about the scrambled eggs. So it has this beautiful movement through it, and for me, it's the kind of material that you really want. You know, it's the kind of material that feels like a gift because you just get to explore so much in the scene. And I love doing it, and I loved working with Dom. I think he's an incredible actor, and he absolutely broke my heart. And that was the day he gave me a compliment. It was a big day for me. And he went, "Yes, we know, you're brilliant." I went, "Oh, a compliment." I adored it, and I think, as happens often on The Crown, the material that I was doing is heavy, and it takes you to a really deeply sad place. But there's also a sort of part of your actor's brain that is just having the most amazing time because you get to do this territory and you get to do it with these amazing people. And yeah, that was definitely one of the. I'm like crying. There's all this snot pouring down my face, and then this little actor's antenna like pokes up and goes, "God, this is so good. This is so much fun." And then go back into the scene. Yeah.
And then there's more omelettes.
And then there's more omelettes and more snot, always.
It's such an incredible scene. I believe we'll have the microphones come around again. We should have time for one or two.
Which it manipulated, and you know, in many ways, she's the symbol of invasion in a way, of the paparazzi, of the chasers, and we know that she's emblematic of that. But the actual sort of slow destruction of trust, of understanding, of public rapport, of the consequences of being separated from the family, the loss of security, all that sort of, that slow sort of degradation was devastating for me to learn. In a way, I couldn't believe when I was learning this that by the end of her life she was just out on the street by herself. You just think, how is that possible? She she was so vulnerable, and I think it sort of forced her to kind of move toward things that would protect her, and that's a specific kind of set and people, and so I think that was one of the things. But I think the other thing, and I hope this is what the show can show as well, is that despite how difficult things were for her, the strength that she possessed and the courage to sort of continue, it's sort of unfathomable to me that you would be sort of broken down by so many things, and yet you would still possess the generosity of spirit to reach to people and give them the thing that you're not getting from anywhere. You know, when we think of her, we think of this woman who's capable of giving people so much love. And also the thing that she was able to do was to see people, really sort of see people. And of course the tragedy was that nobody really ever saw her really for who she was in a way. You know, they saw construction, and by the end they saw what they wanted to see as a result of really how the British media was sort of deciding one day to the next who they would support, who they wanted to throw under the bus. And I think that was, you know, kind of, that's part of the tragedy of it.
I have to say, especially having grown up in the UK around this time, it's absolutely phenomenal to see what you've captured in your portrayal of her. So congratulations on an incredible season. Thank you so much for sharing this with us, and thank you so much to all of you as well.